looking like preach. Looking like preach.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Anexinet Infrastructure Modernization Podcast. Today we are going to be talking with a room of worthies about privileged access management and identity and access management. I will let them introduce themselves because they all have complicated names that I don't necessarily know how to pronounce. Let's start here.
Hi, my name is Matt Deeroff. I'm a pre-sales architect with Anexinet.
I'm Damien Lapierre. I'm an identity and access management architect.
My name is Chia Mua. I work for Anexinet, and I am a security architect.
You said that with a question mark.
No question mark.
All right, so what we're trying to talk about is kind of a big topic. I would love to level set and have a couple of very basic questions. Damien, let's start with you. How would you define privileged access management?
It's actually a really good question. Defining privilege is actually the key to that. When we think about access management, we have to think about the difference between a modern user, a usual user of a workforce, and then we have to think about those that have access to the infrastructure behind the tools that are used for the workforce.
So you're talking about the basic split between what you would call a user and an administrator.
Yes. Those that can actually have access to change the infrastructure, to change the data on the back end, that to me defines privilege. Your usual user does not have that access. They're the ones that are working from the front end of the application, and you have different access controls there. But that goes into your usual identity and access management, not your privileged identity.
Right. And also the question between does not have access and should not have access.
Yes, we'll get into that one.
Chia?
Yeah, I would have to agree. So there's different specific types of privileged users, right? So, when you look at all the different types, there's service accounts that does specific things. It connects to specific applications. It's used for like a SQL database. There's local administrator where, hey, I'm a system admin. I'm using this local administrator account to go in to make some changes, do an installation. And then on the back end, I'm an applications admin. I really don't have access to the local box, but because this application's installed on that box, I need to get into the front end web configuration or web UI to make my changes. So yes, privileged users, there's a wide variety of it, and there's many different types of it.
There are. And I think what we're actually talking about with privilege is the ability to change the way that technology interacts with our front-end usual users. If you have the ability to change the way, say, a front-end application can interact with the back-end data, then that defines privilege. If you have the ability to change the back-end infrastructure, which could change that back-end data, that defines privilege. Mm-hmm. Whether it be a human or, as you say, a service account, an application to back-end infrastructure account, that is all privilege.
Yes.
So pivoting a little bit, let's talk about a slightly different idea. How would you, Damien, define identity and access management?
Probably not the way that the current industry would. I really wish the industry would change the concept of identity to digital entity. There's a slight difference, and when it comes down to it, identity and access management needs to kind of change. What the overarching concept is members of workforce, or whether that be, internal workforce, contingent workforce, they had a digital identity, right? Something that uniquely defined them within the IT infrastructure. Identity and access management was first and foremost a password synchronization tool, and then it's developed over time to be governance over that digital identity for a member of your workforce. And the access management side of it became complex across organizations because you had to then marry your digital identity with your business process for that unique kind of job description and job function across your organization, and understand this individual mapped to this identity has to have access to these applications, these functions.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you, Damien. When I think about identity and access management, I always think about this phrase. And it's, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck.
It's probably a platypus.
Right. So, but that whole idea, right? And identity, when identity comes into play, you're not going to have to ask that question. Well, this person, I think his account here is Chia's account, but on Windows, it's the naming convention's like this, and then on the Unix box, well, Chia's naming convention's different on here. And I just remember when I first started out my career in security, and we were looking into identity and access management for an insurance provider, and HIPAA was big and critical. What Damien talked about earlier about how password synchronization was the big win. Well, for myself as a security administrator at the time, I had like 200 passwords across 200 different systems. The biggest win was that if I would tell my manager that it would take me X amount of minutes to change my password and on 200 different systems, I would have to actually put X amount number of minutes away just to do my password resets. But because we brought in an identity management system, and we actually connected to those specific systems, and we call them connectors at the time, I didn't have to put X amount of minutes aside. When I changed my password in Windows, every connector that we had to other systems, it changed that password for me once it identified who I was. That's the beauty of identity. It started out as a simple win across passwords, but then it evolved and became more. And, we still look at role base. And for organizations out there, let's say that you have a role, let's just call it a customer executive role in the West. And then you had a northern region, a southern region, central region, and an eastern region. Well, most people that are customer executives in the western region, you want them to have all this access. So when you use your identity management system correctly and you define your roles correctly, when that person gets in, all of these access are created automatically for that specific user.
Yes. So that brings up the topic of, birthright and least privilege, and understanding the marriage of business process, HR process, and how we translate that with our IT tools. And identity and access management, your platform there sits across all of those.
Yes.
Business, HR, and IT.
Can you define those terms really quickly? When you talk about birthright and the principle of least privilege, what does that mean?
Birthright. That is a definition of, we'll say, an HR role, right? And by HR role, I don't mean human resources specific role. What I mean is a role for an organization, say a systems administrator, that is defined at your human capital management system, be it whatever platform, PeopleSoft, Workday, it doesn't matter. That's where it's defined. And as part of that role, you have an understanding of the business process that role will need access to X number of system, and that is birthright. The fun part is, as an identity and access management architect, I have to understand that business process, and I have to understand the HR system, have that synchronized from a enterprise function, and then translate that in our identity platform to be able to provision that unique identity from a birthright perspective in the endpoint applications.
So it's kind of defining what does a system administrator mean first,
Yes.
and then putting people into that role, as opposed to what happens in a lot of places where it goes in the opposite direction.
Right. So that's always been the difficulty, is an enterprise has an understanding from a business level, we need to make money. And in order to make money, we need applications. And that's as far as the upper echelons really think about it. They try and translate that to HR processes and human resources, and human resources in and of itself is a fantastic function, but it's also defined by state and federal regulations, and that's what they're trying to meet first and foremost, not what the enterprise or business is really trying to attain. So the fun part is that in order to be successful with identity and access management, understand the business process, the HR process, get them talking so you can translate that into actual identity needs, application needs, and without being able to do that, all you'll have is a password synchronization tool.
Right. And Chia, what does the principle of least privilege mean to you?
Oh, it's being in IT this long. I've been in IT since 1999. So I've had a,
37-year career.
at some time in it. But one thing that I always see with the different organizations that I work for is that, the role-based model is never truly a role-based model, right? Because you might have these roles, but let's say that, okay, so Jill worked at HR and Jill had all these access. Well, now Jill's no longer here, but they hire Mary. So guess what? Mary's role is not the same as Jill's, but guess what we're going to do? We're just going to clone Mary's access and we're going to give it to Jill. That way we know that Jill can do everything that Mary can. That's the opposite of least privilege, because now we're giving some new person the access to do everything the old person can, even though that person might not be doing all those. So when you look at least privilege, you're going to say, no, we can't do that. We're not going to clone this account. We're going to look at Jill. We're going to look at her specific roles and functions, and we're going to give her the access that she needs just to do her job, not to do Mary's old job.
I used to work for this organization that thought they had least privilege. They had about 2,000 applications across their business, and their concept of least privilege was everyone will need an Active Directory account and everyone will need a Lotus Notes account for email. That was their idea of least privilege. When you take into account that you have an accounting function, you have a legal function, you have a manufacturing floor function, you have a shipping and receiving function, and even within your accounting function, you have accounts payable and accounts receivable, and you need to factor in separation of duties. There's a lot to least privilege that business process does not actually understand from a C-level oh, yes, it makes sense. Everyone should have an Active Directory account. Everyone should have access to email. But then we break it down further and further and further based on organizational functional need.
Right, and I agree with you there because, like, I've worked for manufacturing companies that they give everybody an Active Directory account, and the only time that they actually log in is to do their timesheet. What happens when you have more accounts than you need? You have a risk, right? So in security, we call that a risk because now there's multiple ways to get in. Now, instead of having just let's say you were saying 2,000 users, maybe only 600 of those people needed AD accounts. Now we have an extra 1,200 account. Will they ever even check email? Because they don't even have a machine, right? So it's kind of like,
Right.
if I don't have a machine, why do I even need an account? But it's for specific functions like doing your timesheet.
Which seems like exactly what we're trying to avoid, right? When we talk about the roles that we're putting together, if you just start at the beginning and say, everybody needs an Active Directory account, that's not necessarily true for the various roles that we're trying to carve out for people.
Correct. So at the end of the day, we have to understand who needs access to what, when, where from, and why. The big factor is why. Without understanding the business process, business need, and HR data that you're getting, translation of that is not going to be possible.
Right.
Damien, and in your experience, we always have company culture, right? So there's the reality of this is what we're supposed to do to be compliant. But then there's this company culture of, well, this is how we've been doing things for the last X amount of years. Why are you pushing us to do something that we don't care about or we've never done before? And, when those things come into play, there's a word that I see that, it has to come to every architect's life. It's called perseverance. Does that word exist in your life?
I'm going to have to take some time with that one. The idea is that you're always going to fight business culture. And that in and of itself is a misnomer because you really shouldn't fight it. You should embrace it. You should find the way to move into that business culture and bring people along. I recently pushed a certificate management platform for the organization that I work for right now. And the way that I got the organization to say, oh yes, we need this, is by saying, if you do not know your certificate infrastructure, then when you are engaging with your global presence, your customer base, and they receive warnings that your sites are not safe, you're going to lose customers. You're going to lose brand reputation.
Absolutely.
You're going to lose your business. So, information security, right? Identity and access management, the way we interact with our customers and our global presence. If we do not do this right, we are going to risk our ability to make money. We're going to lose our ability to be a brand.
And that kind of harkens back to what you said at the beginning. Like when you talked about identity, it was not about people, it was about digital assets. One which could be an employee, one which could be the certificate that supports the publicly facing website.
I really hope that, the industry catches up. Identity is not users. It is a digital entity that has context among an IT ecosystem. We all have mobile devices here, right? They are uniquely defined across the provider, right? That they interact with. Okay. Then, and they have context, right? We use them in a certain way. They call out, connect to another service to another phone, that is an identity translation. Chia, I see you have your laptop in front of you. That is uniquely defined across whatever network you connect to. That's a digital entity, right? That's a digital identity that is probably registered within your organization's, we'll just say it looks like a laptop that has Windows installed on it. So it's understood in an Active Directory domain somewhere as a unique digital identity. When it comes down to it, there has to be a change to understand digital entity and access management.
Right, and in some of the simplest of terms, Chia is one person. He is associated with his laptop. He is also associated with his cell phone, and the two interact in very different ways. The two should have completely different fingerprints when it comes to the access that they are granted or expected to ask for.
Yes, that's the marriage of understanding the user identity, the device identity, and the access that the user should have on a device. That's where we get into extreme complexity.
Right. Well, that's what we're here for. We're going to talk about quantum theory in 5 minutes, so brace yourself.
Oh, fantastic.
But Chia, from a security perspective, you build those kinds of profiles. You have the expectation of user is going to use his laptop in such and such a way. User is going to use his cell phone in such and such a way. That gives you something to look at in terms of looking for anomalies. Because if all of a sudden huge amounts of access are coming through your cell phone, that might be perceived as problematic.
You know, right now, the key terms that we hear all the times in IT is AI and machine learning, right? So there are really good tools out there that, you know, they actually specifically uses those technology. And look, so let's say my laptop. So my laptop has its own identity, as Damien stated. So now this tool examines my laptop and it says, okay, so from Monday to Friday, this laptop that Chia uses, it goes out and it connects to these specific servers. Well, what are these servers? And it doesn't really know, but if somebody would look at my log, it would say, okay, so Chia is in security. He's connecting to these host names. Oh, these are part of the privileged access management system. When they look at these logs, they go, this is normal for Chia. From Monday to Friday, Chia works here, and you know he's accessing these endpoints, and it makes sense because this is the ecosystem and that he supports. Now, on Saturday, out of the blue, Chia is now connecting to this server in Brazil. Well, does the organization that he is working for, do they have an office in Brazil? And if they do, why is he reaching out to this specific host name in Brazil at 2 o'clock in the morning? So now this is where the machine learning and the AI comes into place, because it's saying like, okay, so this is the norm. Chia's only doing he's hitting these systems from Monday to Friday. We've been seeing this trail, this log for the last 5 months. All of a sudden, he's hitting somewhere else. So this is the anomaly you're talking about.
So what you're really referring to, I think, is user and entity behavior analytics.
Yes.
Right? Being able to say this entity is consistently doing this, and sometime that entity is now doing something different.
Yes. And now you can come back and you can say, hey, Chia, we've seen these logs. Why are you going out here? I'm like, oh, yeah, because we're doing a test. We happen to have a site out there. We're going to be supporting that specific application, and we're only doing it at 2 o'clock in the morning on the weekends so that there's no outage, you know, and then that makes sense.
Sure.
But when you reach out to me and I'm like, I have no idea. I didn't know that my system's doing that. So there's definitely a breach somewhere. You have to take an action item and say, what's going on?
What would you say, when you look at the landscape of these two different philosophies, have the biggest changes over the past 10 years?
And in addition to the biggest changes of the past 10 years, maybe elaborate a little bit about what you think we need to see in the future.
You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Well, like what Damien said earlier about identity and access management, like identity management in general, like, what we saw is that when it first came out, it was just a password. We saw that, yes, that password management was a big win. And then now, like Damien was saying, like now it's more of a digital identity. And now we're trying to link all these things together. Like, okay, so yes, there's the user perspective, and then there's the hardware perspective or device perspective. With the implementation of or creation of AI and machine learning, it's going to be exciting.
I'm probably not going to actually speak to the actual question. I'll actually go back to the idea of user and entity behavior analytics. When that was originally defined, it was user behavior analytics. It had nothing to do with entity. And then I'll go back to the idea that we're still, as an industry in identity and access management, saying a human or a thing is an identity. Really, everything is digital. I'm talking into a microphone that is connected to a bunch of infrastructure that is sitting behind me, and it's digitally recording everything I'm saying, right? But each connected device along that trail has its own unique digital identity. Everything we do on a day-to-day basis has its own digital identity.
Taking a step back, if I was just starting and I wanted to, I was tasked with the job of creating an identity and access management program for my company. I hear password sync, that's 10 years ago. But to me, not having anything, that sounds like a great baseline and a great place to start. I think as a starting point, there's also some really great concepts that we talk about that I need to keep in mind moving forward. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking, let's say, to develop, implement this for your company, kind of what would be the roadmap that you guys would kind of see?
So what you would really want to do, and why password synchronization was a key benefit, is because you're creating efficiency. Information security, identity and access management should not be the hammer that comes down on an organization and its efficiency. It should be the enabler of efficiencies across your organization.
And that is a great point, and I think one that is often missed when you talk security with organizations and your C-level folks, that you really need the buy-in. I think that's really a great point.
So one question I would ask, do you think there is such a thing as an organization that is either too young or too small to start implementing these types of things?
That's a really fantastic question.
That's why I asked it.
Oh, of course. So I recently started my own business. In so doing, I had to have a digital footprint. And I took my identity and access management knowledge and applied that to how I was going to set up that digital footprint, right? So no organization should be created in our modern age without that understanding.
Some organizations, they feel that we don't have a big enough footprint. So, the hackers out there, they're not going to care about us. But the reality is that hackers care about one thing, right? There's this thing called money. So, yes, so for any organization, if you're planning to make money, you better have something in place. You better have your identity. You better have some sort of security solution in place so that you at least protect yourself. And the reality about IT security is that we don't have a one-stop shop or one solution to protect everything. It's all about layers.
So I just want to add one point of clarity. Yes, when we think about businesses that are for profit, right? But let's not discount the idea that we really have a lot of nonprofit organizations that still have digital footprints, and they need to understand those same protections.
So what I'm hearing is that every company needs a security program. It just depends on, let's say, the scope of what that program could be. So, identifying what assets are really important to you, whether that's your money, whether that's your intellectual property, whether that as a nonprofit, someone trying to disrupt those things. We're so enthusiastic about security and what we need to protect. We inhibit the business sometimes and don't necessarily sell the key points like what is valuable to us to protect as a starting point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and some of the things, relatively speaking, when it comes to security that IAM, PAM take care of in terms of low-hanging fruit, like accounts that are created, the user's moved on, but the account was never deactivated. Things that enabled like shadow IT. It's easier for an administrator to just log in through a back door than it is to go through proper processes. These are things that we can control and keep eyes on from a policy perspective and from a security perspective that just takes those kinds of issues off the table, or at least limits their potential for damage.
Right. So you saw me hesitate there.
Yep.
So
Thought you were going to throw a chair.
So understanding, policy and having a connection with your, again, HR systems to be able to do your joiner, your mover, your leaver, access, provisioning, and deprovisioning is definitely necessary for human users, right? But where's the actual governance around all of your non-human users? And I think, going back to your question earlier about where I see identity and access management going in the future is definitely some sort of governance over all of your non-human identities.
So let's say, for example, you guys are consultants and you walk into an organization that has grown organically. It started out as a 2-person shop. Now they're a 100-person shop. They've never implemented any of these processes in any serious, significant, policy-based way. Where do you start?
Well, and a little bit beyond that, or maybe before that, how do you achieve buy-in? So
here's the thing. When you're talking about trying to get buy-in, there was a defined process, right? A ticket goes into this part of the organization. A job is done, a task is done, and then that generates a new ticket or a sub-ticket, if you will, that goes to a different function to do some other task, etc., etc., etc. The process moves on, and that's the key. That's actually the key, is that process.
But to me, that was as the infrastructure manager, extremely frustrating to see those inefficiencies. So my vision at the time was, a new user starts, we need to set a baseline as to what needs to be created and what systems and what is the minimum security level they would require. So I would foresee, I would want one account to be created by one person and that flow through all our systems.
Why does it have to be by one person, right? It should all actually be automated to minimize the risk to the organization, right? And the only way that you can do that is by understanding all of those processes. And the only way you can do that is by generating the buy-in that you were talking about. And in order to get that, it has to map back to risk exposure, profit loss, and profit generation, right? Sometimes, being IT, we hear that, again, we're the bleed. We cost money. Well, if we can show that there's a return on investment is it's funny. I have to fill out scorecards and everything that say, what's the return on investment for implementing X security tool? Well, I actually threw that back at my organization recently, and I said, there is no return on investment. None whatsoever. But I'll just add one letter to that ROI, and I will show you that if you do not invest in this, you will lose potentially billions of dollars over the next 5 years. And it is actually a risk of not investing. It's not an ROI. It's an RONI. If you do not do this, this is your exposure. So let's minimize that risk. Spend $1 million now to save potentially $5 billion in the future.
Seems like a win.
It was total win.
All right. Well, we're winding up our time here. Matt, do you have any final thoughts you want to add?
No, I don't think so. I mean, made some great points, and it's a little enlightening as you reflect back on previous situations. So, it's interesting to hear you think, the process we already had in place. But I agree your point in IT as a cost center. We were always overhead. So somehow you had to come up with that. What is this going to make for the company? Where's that ROI? Is it our staff, our billable staff being able to have more hours? Is that dollar amount to, our intellectual property that we might lose by not doing these things? So I think, in this podcast, we covered a lot of great topics and some really important ones around how you would look to actually begin a security and identity and access management program with your company. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, Matt. Chia?
Well, when I look at it, you have to look at this from a different perspective. It's IT security. What I'm trying to do here is not get our organization to be compromised, right? So now I'm no longer Chia, the IT security guy. I have a specific relationship to you. I'm preventing our organization from being breached, and I'm going to keep you employed. So when you know Chia as, Chia's my friend from security, and he's trying to help us so that we can all just have a job and we can continue to live our lives. And it's like any relationship. How do you have a good relationship? Well, we talk. We got to talk. So I got to talk to marketing. I got to talk to HR. I got to talk to everybody. And the more that I talk with you, the more that you know me. And before you know it, we have a relationship.
And you're working together.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Right. So instead of controls, it's enablement.
Yes.
That's where the security industry has been trying to change to, right? We don't want to control. All we want to do is securely enable everyone to be able to be happy and free. Other than that, I have no real final thoughts. Wait, maybe one. All right, final thought. If you want to understand identity and access management, privileged identity and access management, then you can use really any tool vendor out there. And you will fail with all of them if you do not actually marry what you're trying to do with those tools with your actual business need.
Plug it like bridge.
That's it.